Hello, welcome, Pankaj. How are you?
Thank you.
Good. So now the final session for today is titled Hindu Revival and Its Future. So we have Pankaj Saxena. I'd like to read out a few words about him. Um, so before I read, what I've written, I'd just like to mention that I'm really excited about Pankaj Saxena ji. He is one of the young thinkers who holds a lot of promise, and I keep reading, what he writes on social media. I hope, he writes a longer version, maybe of articles or books, which I would love to read. Just something to read about him. Pankaj Saxena is an author who writes on Hindu temples, Indian art, literature, history, and culture. He is also deeply interested in cultural anthropology, evolutionary biology, and ecology. He has visited more than 600 ancient Hindu temples on his temple trails. He writes for India Facts, Indic Today, Swarajya, Surf News, Vijayawani, etc. He has authored 3 books so far. He currently works at Center for Indic Studies, Indus University, Ahmedabad, and he edits Indic Varta. So with that, I'd now like to request Pankaj to please start his conversation with Conrad Ernst. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you, Srinivas ji. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. First of all, I thank Srinivas ji, I thank Harikaran ji and Indica Academy for giving me this opportunity to interview Dr. Elst. As a kid, when I was 18 and 19 years old, when I stumbled across the works of Voice of India, he was one of the greatest intellectual stars that I read. And so it is really, it's not an exaggeration, it's not a metaphor when I say that it is really a miracle come true for me when I get to interview him on this event. So I cannot thank my stars enough. Dr. Elst, namaskar.
Namaskar.
Thank you for doing whatever you do and whatever you will keep doing in future. So I shall thank at the outset. Now let me get on to the first question. Uh, Everyone is talking about right now, inside India and outside India, inside this movement and outside this movement, that there is a Hindu movement, and people are discussing a lot of things about it. So my question to you is, what is the condition of this so-called Hindu movement, and where is it leading to? Especially, I'll just clear my context. If you see the history of the past 2000 years, the history of prophetic monotheism versus pagan polytheistic dharmic sects. So, on one hand, if you see the history of the past 2000 years, it is a very grim situation indeed. Unequivocally, it has been a rise and rise and rise of prophetic monotheism. Country by country, nation by nation, tribe by tribe, people by people, they are defeating pagan polytheistic dharmic sects. India, China, and Indochina are the last remaining strongholds. And if these are strongholds, then we can imagine that what other countries or people are the situation that they are in. So, on one hand, it's a very grim situation if you look at the history. But on the other hand, at the same time, you have been at the center of this very important event in the lifetimes of Hindus right now, the rebuilding of the grand Ram temple at Ayodhya. So this is a very big issue for Hindus, of course, for Hindu society, for Hindu people, nation, culture, that everyone agrees upon. But if you see it in a larger context, then this is the first case in which a pagan polytheistic dharmic society has managed to forcibly reclaim a site which has been central to them. So there was a mosque when they started this movement. It came down, it was brought down, and then with whatever means possible, legal, social, political, they are actually rebuilding the temple. This has never happened before. Only Spain and Portugal have been able to reclaim their lands and some other countries in Europe, but then they are Christian culture. So they are once again a prophetic monotheistic ideology reclaiming from another prophetic monotheistic ideology. But this is the first instance when a dharmic society has reclaimed ground from prophetic monotheism. So in these two opposing trends, on one hand, a very grim record, on other hand, a very positive sign, you can say. So my question is that, can India be the Stalingrad of prophetic monotheism? Thank you.
All right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yes. Yeah, I still have to sort of get used to the image, but right now, of course, that's a very optimistic thing to say, in the sense that, in spite of this little success in Ayodhya, Hinduism seems to go backwards still. Even with this Hindu government, it is continuing the secularist and minority appeasement policies of Congress. The numerical strength of Hindus keeps on declining, which means that the territorial strength is also declining, because here and there pockets in India are effectively becoming Islamic republics, or in the south also Christian domains. Like I saw the government poster about the last village in India that was given electricity. And so the main building in the picture was a Christian church. Um, so, so the enemy forces are making headway, and Hinduism isn't doing much against it. Um, and so that demographic thing, there's not much you can do against it. There's something to some extent, yes, Israel has done it. In Israel, you have the Orthodox who have big families, 10 children, and unlike in Africa, their 10 children also survive. Um, then, even among the seculars, you have a certain consciousness of demography, like Shimon Peres as prime minister called on all Jews to have at least 4 children. So, to some extent, that can work, but among the Hindus, as I know them, it won't work. Even in India, the Orthodox also practice birth control, let alone the secular, Hindus. So it's just not going to happen. If the Shankaracharya of Puri calls on Hindus to have bigger families, well, I think it falls on deaf ears. And anyway, I'm not too sure that in an already overpopulated country, a demographic race is the solution. So the thing to do is the one that is historically correct, namely, most Muslims in India are converts from Hinduism. There were, of course, invaders who settled in India. So I suppose most Muslims have some Arab or Turkish ancestry, a little bit of it. But mostly their ancestry consists of converts. Like, for instance, all the native women who were taken as wives by the Muslim invaders were, of course, native. And then the generations further on, it's just native. Okay, so the problem immediately points at the solution is to reconvert them. And here we come to the Indian application of a worldwide development, which is Muslims apostatizing from Islam. Now, this is insufficiently realized in India, mainly because in India itself you don't see it much, which is Muslims leaving Islam. In the West, you have many pockets of strong Muslim concentration where this hardly happens. You also have areas where Muslims very much live amid non Muslims. There it is much easier. And so you see that all while Islam is still growing demographically and institutionally, because it is facilitated by the Western governments. Nevertheless, there's also a larger and larger number of ex-Muslims, and often they affirm themselves even at the risk of their lives. And like right now, the main literature about critical about Islam is by these ex-Muslims. In India, you had Sitaram Goel writing critically about Islam. He has hardly any followers, but no matter, today everyone in India can go to the internet, find the sites, often by ex-Muslims, where all the problematic verses in the Quran are listed, where all the problematic facts of Islamic history are written, and so on. So this movement away from Islam is very much there. It is less there where Muslims are in adversarial relation with non-Muslims. It is remarkably there in countries like Tunisia, where Muslims are among themselves. And so on TV, on the internet, and so on, they find non-Islamic influences that appeal to them, and they grow away from Islam, often still only silently, but so in some remarkable cases also very vocally and bravely. So in India, you will have less of that for two reasons: because of the adversarial relation with their surroundings, but also because the secularists greatly patronize Islam, favor Islam. And you have these appeasement policies that are even continued by the BJP. So it is advantageous to be a Muslim. Now, among that, you will certainly have Muslims who are only Muslim in name precisely because of the advantages, but who have also mentally grown away from Islam. And as non-Muslims, there is not very much you can do about this. You can simply hope that this development away from Islam continues and gains strength, which I think ultimately it will. But certainly among about these appeasement policies, you can make all the difference. Just like in Europe, the government policies can make it unpleasant to be a Muslim, can make the Muslims feel, oh my God, there's something wrong. What am I doing here? I don't fit in. Um, so there, I mean, within the confines of the Constitution of human rights and so on, you should not discriminate against Muslims, but at any rate, you should make them feel, hey, you stand out. We are pluralistic and so on. You stand out by being so fanatic. And so that'll encourage them to question Islam. And here I I take courage from my own experience as an apostate Catholic, and who lived through a period where a whole society turned around. You see, in the northern half of Belgium, called Flanders, the Dutch-speaking part, Catholicism reigned supreme into the 60s, 70s. Everyone in my class went to Mass, to church every Sunday. We were all baptized and so on and so on. Now, in the 50s, like my uncle was a parish priest, and so he was the chaplain of the brass band, of the women's guild, of the youth movement, and so on and so on. He was a typical incarnation of the all-seeing eye of the church in every corner of society. That was the social reality back then. Now, only 20 years later, this was completely collapsing. And today, practically no one goes to church anymore. And so, and even Christian organizations with a long history are changing their names, are dropping the label Christian, are not even pretending anymore. So Christianity is pretty much over among Europeans. So I do not exclude such a scenario for Islam in India.
Okay. So you are essentially saying that there is more hope outside the Hindu movement than there is inside it for for this to work.
Well, what all these India watchers outside don't realize is that their identification of Hindu movement with the Sangh Parivar, with the RSS and its affiliates, is not correct. You see, there was always a Hindu movement outside the RSS. Even the specific identification of Hinduism with India, what I call Hindu nationalism, already predates the RSS. You find it in the Uttar speech by Sri Aurobindo, for example. And for a long time, these were just individuals who had no power, who could once in a while say their thing. But now, increasingly, due to new technology, this organizational form of the RSS is becoming quaint. And so Hindus are self-organizing in all these internet platforms. Indic Academy, of course, is a major one. All these uh, all these online papers that you write for, exist outside the Sangh, have come up outside the Sangh. Of course, are being read also by Sangh people, and so gradually it exerts more and more influence inside the Sangh, which I greatly welcome. Because after all, Sangh people usually have a great loyalty to the RSS, but at the same time, their prime loyalty is to Hinduism. It's only in the top rungs that they lose sight of Hinduism and are only loyal to the Sangh. But so, these people have a Hindu feeling, and when they read your texts, for example, on India Fact or so, uh, that appeals to them. So this independent Hindu activism is gaining ground. And so if there is hope, that's where it is.
Yeah. So my next question, which you have already partly answered, is that what is the role of the Sangh Parvar, the RSS, in this movement? And this is the general question. The larger question would be, what is the role of a political movement inside a movement like this, a socio-religious movement like the Hindu revival is touted to be? Or even if, like many are claiming now, even if the politics of the movement fails, like many are claiming now that it is failing, is it possible for the movement to succeed, for the social renaissance or revival to succeed, even if the politics is not up to the mark?
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, there are, of course, good things that Narendra Modi has done and is
Yeah.
doing. Those I have no quarrel with, of course. But as for specifically the Hindu cause, he is, of course, failing badly. And it's disappointing and it's worrying to that extent that a political situation like you have today, I'm not sure you will get it back. So if in 2024 or 29, the BJP loses power, it risks being for some time, and it risks being against a determined anti-Hindu, or at least anti-Hindutva, that's certainly, enemy. You see, in the 70s, Jaya Prakash Narayan led a movement against Indira Gandhi. And so that was totally on the sidelines, although it made headlines in the newspapers, but politically, strictly speaking, it was insignificant. Yet then, those in Congress who were against Indira, like Morarji Desai, and the other parties, took heart and got together and managed to win the elections in 77 and formed an alternative non-Congress government. Even though at that time, non-Congress was a very disparate, motley crowd of very divergent parties. So this can happen again. Today, the strength of the BJP is the division of the opposition, the dividedness of the opposition. And you cannot exclude a scenario where some Jaya Prakash Narayan manages to unite the opposition, at least unite them sufficiently for an electoral alliance that defeats the BJP. This is quite possible. And then we will see whether the, more pro-Hindu sounds that the Congress nowadays gives, whether these are really meant or not. But so it risks being a seriously anti-Hindu government. And then you will greatly regret that you let the time pass when you could have implemented things like the abolition of the anti-Hindu discriminations in the constitution, the abolition of the appeasement policies. So, I mean, of course, the normalization in Kashmir will be a legacy to be proud of, but the really important things may not have been done, and the opportunity may simply have passed. So that I think is a very serious failing on Narendra Modi's part. But he still has 3 years the time to correct that. So let's be optimistic.
Okay. Uh, so the next question is, what did Sri Ram Sarupji think about the performance of the RSS at the first place and the Hindu movement? We all know that Sri Sita Ramji in his later years was very critical of the Sangh,
Mhm.
not very hopeful about it. But Sri Ram Sarupji held his opinion even to his last years. He was not very critical of the
Yeah.
RSS. He never was. Of course, it was not in his nature to castigate individuals, institution as such. He just wrote and very softly about ideas and institutions, about
Mhm.
great grand ideas. But even then, you see, you sense, you read between the lines when you read the entire uh, literature of Ramsarup that he was perhaps more hopeful than Sri Sitaramji about the direction of the movement. So, what do you have to say
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah. First of all, the Sangh Parivar then was not the same as what it is now. Like in 1996, the VHP, I think, had a campaign, um, Hindu India, secular India, meaning all the freedoms that the minorities enjoy are thanks to the fact that this is a Hindu country, not a Muslim country. Um, so that line is perfectly fine with me. And so I'm not surprised that Ramsarup also, supported it. But today, you see, to say that all Indians are Hindus, I don't think he would have approved of
Yeah.
that. But yes, you see, I mean, he was a diplomatic sort of person. And so he didn't want to rock the boat. He saw, well, today the RSS, that's what we have. So we have to make the best of it. And if they don't understand issues, well, then it is our job as intellectuals to make them see. So yeah, so he was hopeful, and the comparison he often used was, okay, at the time of the Bangladesh war, all we had was Indira Gandhi. There were many things wrong with Indira Gandhi. Nevertheless, she won the war. And so, whatever may be wrong with the RSS, well, this is what we have. Let's support it. So
Okay.
that was a reasonable position in the 1990s. Today, of course, we are in a far better position to develop a Hindu critique of all the current situations, and thus from the outside influence the RSS.
Okay. Of course. Thank you. So another thing about Sri Ram Sarupji was that without him, we would not be, I think, so conscious about the side that we are fighting on. The alliance with pagan polytheistic sects all over the world that Sri Ram
Hmm.
Sarupji advocated. I don't think that all of us, our movement would have been this conscious about which camp we are fighting on.
Yes.
Because the camp against us, prophetic monotheists, they know very well whom they are fighting against. They know
Hmm.
that we are these idolaters. These are the worst kind of people, and they have to be converted first. But the idolaters do not themselves know. They take their identity from the region that they belong to, from the
Yeah.
community and the country that they belong to. But Ram Sarupji was very, very vocal in showing us the identification with the pagan polytheistic dharmic sects. Along
Hmm.
with that, he was also very hopeful about Hindu Buddhist alliance as a dharmic alliance against the prophetic
Hmm.
monotheistic alliance. So, what do you
Yes.
say about his take on the relationship of Hinduism with sister dharmic sects like Buddhism, Jainism, and other pagan polytheistic sects?
Yes. Well, about the pagan scene in Europe, I know a few things. And so, it started as a sort of hippie-ish pastime and was not taken very seriously. I'd say that in a scholarly respect, it has become far better, has a far higher quality in the sense that now you have a movements in every country of doing it historically correct, or doing research into what ancient paganism was. Which doesn't mean that they want to revive human sacrifice or so. Um, I mean, it's a modern thing. People understand that if we revive paganism, it is as a modern religion, which has references to the ancient period, but is of our own time. Um, so in that respect, it is coming into its own. Another respect that is given undue publicity, but nevertheless, it's best to take it into account, is that here and there, these movements sharply fall into nationalism. Um, and, as a European, post-war, I don't think too positively of nationalism. I mean, nationalism was great in the 20s when the RSS was founded, but, with the fervor of nationhood in World War One. But, after 1945, it fell into disrepute. And me too, I don't think too highly of nationalism. Though I can see, sometimes India really means Hinduism, like in Voice of India. And so reviving pagan movements often call themselves ethnicos, ethnic, of their own country, as opposed to Christianity, which was imported. Or like there are Arab neo-pagans, mind you, Arab neo-pagans, they call themselves Wataniya, national of the fatherland. Um, so okay, I know how to deal with it, but sometimes it really is nationalist in a very nasty sense. And so, particularly in America, also in Germany, somewhat, you find groups who link Germanic paganism with the Nazi heritage, which is very illiterate. The Nazis were not in favor of Germanic people, especially Hitler was very derogatory about it. Um, but okay, this is a reality. So you have to deal with it. You have to be discerning who am I dealing with. I'd say in Belgium, at the encouragement of Ramswell, I became a member of a then just founded neo-pagan society where you had the influence of a number of kids of East Front volunteers who had fought in the Nazi army, and they strongly brought their own prejudices in there. So my job the first year, simply because of loyalty of this idea of ancient religion, was to weed out these influences, in which I dare say I succeeded because right now this organization, all the newcomers, don't even know about this history. So that's really gone. It's also because of the atmosphere is changing. I mean, this reminiscence of the Second World War and so on, that's gone already anyway. Um, but so there you have to be discerning. But mostly that's not there. That's only falsely attributed to it by outsiders. But still, I mean, as Hindus, you should be careful. Then another problem is that often these groups are very new age, non-serious, are into nature, and I mean nature worship in a sort of exaggerated way, feminism and so on. So that's nice, but within the proper proportion, and often does injustice to the ancient traditions. Though sometimes also that's necessary. Like, for instance, there was a Native American movement. They came for some event in Berlin, and um, everybody was getting, men and women were getting together. Now, some of the Native Americans who participated criticized it. They said, look here, you see, when we do this in our tribe, men and women are separate. Now, maybe that's a tradition that should be changed, or maybe not, but at any rate, we should be conscious of it. So anyway, I mean, this is a complicated field, but the principle is entirely correct. You see what Hinduism is for India, those religions were for those other countries before Christianity displaced them. As for Buddhism, you see an alliance between India and Japan at the moment. But you see, most Buddhists outside India do not associate Buddhism with anti-Hinduism the way it is happening in India. So they're like good Buddhists, they're traditional, real Buddhists, as opposed to India where there's a little ideological problem.
Okay. Okay. So, in this light, what do you think Hindu activism is into, or outside the sun? What is the condition of Hindu activism? First question, and second, we can see, as you already have mentioned in this interview, that there are some science, various organizations, intellectual organizations, which are working for Hindu revival, like Indic Academy, of course, like the organization in which I work, Center for Hindu
Mm,
Studies. Do you also see other social organizations which are not exactly intellectual in nature, but which are
mm,
outside the ambit of the Sangh, but they are still working for Hindu revival? So, can
right.
you? Yeah.
Well, you see, at first I thought, well, this is an interesting development, more Hindus speaking out, more Hindu self-organization, but it is as yet only a purely verbal thing. It's mouse clicking activism, as Rajiv Malhotra calls it. But then look at what happened in Kerala last year, the Sabarimala movement. You see, this was a almost spontaneous mobilization, which was given intellectual input by people like Anjali George. But so there you had an immediate, direct, spontaneous contact between the intellectual fighters and the masses on the ground.
Yeah.
So I don't think that this is purely an intellectual pastime.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that's very encouraging, because we cannot bank the revival of a complete culture and civilization just on intellectual organizations.
Mhm.
There has to be a social counterpart of it.
Yes. Mm.
So that's very encouraging. So, where do you think this movement in total is heading towards? Let's say I will try to limit it more. Where do you see this movement in the next decade?
Well, the next decade at any rate has a special situation that this movement or a party that claims to be part of this movement is in power. And for very long, you were in the opposition. So in the opposition, it is good to count on what I use Boy Scout initiatives, little initiatives on the side, you know, using a lot of volunteer energy, a lot of idealism. But that can only have results here and there a little bit. Whereas now you have the power. You can reorganize the country, you can change the laws. There was 5 years ago some RSS initiative to train volunteers as storytellers because they noticed that the knowledge of the Mahabharata was declining. So they wanted storytellers to go to the village and call the whole population together in the village square and tell stories. Well, that's nice. I'm not at all against it. But you see, when you have the power, you can change the school curriculum. You see, schools are far more important for a modern population than for the ancient villages. And so use your power. And so many school teachers who would never volunteer for becoming storytellers in villages will teach those stories simply because it's in the curriculum. So the fact that the BJP is not doing its job is a really serious problem. And so for the moment, I mean, I have a hard time speculating about the deeper future because for the moment, the thing to do is to somehow make the BJP people see sense. You see, they have a power to make an enormous difference, and they are not using it.
Yeah.
And that's very very crucial.
Yeah. So my last question to you would be, in the last 10 to 15 years, uh, actually in my working career, when I became conscious of this movement,
Mhm.
uh, another force, another very, very powerful force has entered India and Indian society. When I was growing up until 2000, Indian society was not as modernized. But now, in the past 20 years, along with the spread of internet and education and other Western things, because education, as we are doing it right now
Mhm.
in India, is a very
Yes,
Western institution. There is
yes.
nothing indigenous about it. So, along with that, Western attitudes of atomization of a society, the individualistic tendencies that they are now nurturing inside our kids and through education, through colleges and universities. So now we see that Hindu kids or Hindu youth of now, in a large part, is also concerned only about very petty and personal issues on one hand. And on the
Mhm.
other hand, the Muslim youth, because and the Christian youth also in some proportion, because they are also educated by their own institution,
Mhm.
and through internet they are getting stronger and becoming better and better Muslims, as if
Yes.
we put it like that. So in this is a new force in India which is splintering Hindu society into atoms, into individuals, and on the other hand also strengthening the opponents of Hindu culture and civilization. So where do you think, this will be my last question, where do you think our society is heading to? Because you have seen the breaking down of society in Western Europe right in front of your eyes.
Mhm. Yes.
Change happens in every generation, but the change that you must have seen there, and change even I have seen, because I was very close to my grandmother, and the India that she was familiar about, it is no longer, it's like she's living in another universe with the
Mhm.
India that has become now.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so the society is breaking down. In that regard, where do you think we are heading, or is this going to have a negative effect on us or a positive effect on the movement? Thank you.
Well, it only proves how necessary you are, because if something isn't done to as American conservatives say, to stand athwart history and yell stop. Okay, if this evolution is not reversed, then Hindu society is simply going to disappear. If, like for instance, the language being taught in schools, very influential because it means that people are reading not just Shakespeare, but all these modern, neo, let's say, cultural Marxist, woke literature, which is all anti-Hindu.
Yeah.
So they'll be conditioned mentally to, at best, be indifferent to Hinduism, or more often to be actively hostile to Hinduism. So it is very necessary to create public opinion in the opposite sense, which is what you are doing. But it is even more necessary to take control of the education system. It's absolutely urgent. You see, in the past, uh, people drank in Hinduism, it was in the air. It was automatically there. And so the Muslims might be in power or so, but Hindus growing up as Hindus became 100% Hindu. And now that's no longer the case. And so, like the Christian missionaries, for example, greatly support the movement towards English because it means Hindus getting estranged from Hinduism. And then in a later phase, because they look long term, in a later phase, they can fall prey to the actual conversion process. So that's so imperative to take control of your education system, to generate the correct public opinion, but to take control of the institutions. And it doesn't hurt the minorities You don't have to do anything to their schools,
Yeah.
but your own schools you have to take control of. I personally, but I'm not a very ritualist person, but personally, I think it's more important even than taking control of your temples. Of course, I'm in favor of taking control of your temples. That also should happen. But you see, to take control of education is imperative.
Thank you, Dr. Els, for this wonderful session. Only someone like you, who is not only focused on a subject, but he is also interested in every other important thing that is happening around the world. Only he can give us a view which is so comprehensive in nature, which can draw analogies from so many different disciplines. Once again, I thank you for giving me this opportunity of sitting in front of you and interviewing you and Indic Academy, Srinivasji Harikaranji. Thank you very much.
Um, Thank you, Pankaj. Are you able to hear me? I just put on a different.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Pankaj, for your very passionate, way of asking questions and enlivening, the atmosphere here. And Conrad Elst as well has given a lot of insights into what he thinks about these issues. In the last, the question is about education. And Conrad also talked about temples, right? He compared these two issues. So this brings to mind immediately a contrary view. I mean, for example, if you take Maharshi Dayananda Saraswati, right? He's a person who completely opposed temples, right? I mean, he thought that was a cause of the downfall, of the civilization as a whole, and he stressed heavily on education as a means of recovery of the civilization. Now, after his death, immediately after his death, there was a split within Arya Samaj itself about how seriously they would take his the education proposals and all that, and we know where that went now. But no, Sanskrit language, we've failed in being able to get that into the schooling system. All schooling happens in a foreign language. Well, it's moving in the direction. Maybe it's not yet happened across the country, but there is great promise that is being seen in the northern part of the country, because we see from the south that the Hindi speaking people tend to have a stronger grounding in Hindi language than what we see in the south. And I see the great promise among people from the north in leading this country back to taking up regional languages. But then the south sees it as an imposition of Hindi, right, which the north doesn't. North or the west, everywhere else where Hindi is spoken. So how do you see this language situation evolving, and how do you think it'll how is it linked with the education issue? And of course, what education that Dayananda Saraswati talked about is no longer possible, because we have moved on, way ahead, and it is very difficult to bring us back to a point where we can somehow link back to the traditional Indian, education system. So where do you see all this going, Conrad?
Well,
I request everybody else to please switch on their videos. And
yes. Well, the idea of Anglo-Vedic colleges was not bad, in the sense that I would emphasize the learning of Sanskrit and then teach an international language. At the moment, it is English. Okay. So yes, people should know that, but only as a second language. You see, one of the great things about Yogi Adityanath, the reason why I liked him immediately, was the first thing he did when he became chief minister. He introduced English as a second language from childhood onwards in the Hindi medium schools. So I saw very many reactions by Hindi walas saying, "Oh, this is ugly. This downgrades Hindi. This is another victory for English and so on." But no, You see, that was necessary in order to make the Hindi medium schools survive. You see, the, the common people want their children to learn the language of, of career making, the language that has a future. At the moment, that's English, but I would not say, as many Angrezi-walas do, the people want their children to have school in English. That's not true. They want their children to have schooling in a language that gives them a future. Now, this is where the government comes in. It is for the government to decide whether that language will be English. Now, you see, there are Nobel Prizes for Russians and Chinese and Japanese and so on. Many of them have grown up without even knowing English. Nowadays, they also learn English as a second language in school. They can participate in international conferences taking place in English. Nevertheless, their work and especially their thinking is still done in Russian, in German, in Chinese, and so on. So that it is totally false that learning through English medium is necessary to be on board with modern developments. So the government can easily decide that it will from now on promote uh, teaching through the mother tongue and also um, promoting the knowledge of Sanskrit. You see, in 1947, when India became independent, they had practically chosen for Sanskrit. There was a vote in the language committee of the Constituent Assembly, which was 50-50, and then the chairman, Rajendra Prasad, voted for Hindi. This was a very unfortunate event because Hindi has no chance of becoming the link language. It is quite reasonably presented by South Indians, by Bengalis, who don't, value Hindi anyway, who think it's a very boorish language. Whereas Sanskrit had a fighting chance. Of course, Sanskrit is difficult, but then it is difficult for everyone. You see, it doesn't discriminate. It already has a position. Everybody already looks up to it. It would have given India a lot of prestige worldwide, whether for the Buddhist reason or for the Indo-European reason, or simply for the nationalist reason. Every decolonizing country at the moment would look up to this ideal of reviving our own, reviving our native language rather than English. At any rate, in the Constituent Assembly, everyone, 100%, was of the opinion that decolonizing from the British meant doing away with English. So I still think that that is the correct solution. However, I also see that at the moment this is far more difficult than in 1947. So, to pull that off, Hindus will have to do some tough thinking and then mobilize in a big way. And I haven't really figured out yet how to do that. But so the ideal of reducing English to purely a second language, that I'm all for.
Thank
Uh,
you, Conrad. Yeah, go ahead,
Srinivaji,
Pankaj.
yeah, I would just like to add one thought and then finish. You mentioned Maharshi Dayanand ji. Somehow he saw a conflict between pursuing education on one hand or supporting an old institution like the Hindu temple on the other. I have been studying the Hindu temple for the past 7 or 8 years, and I do not see any conflict between the two. On the other hand, I see it as the largest and the strongest Hindu institution, which can actually carry both. When you go to a functioning living temple, Vedas are not the only thing that are being studied there. If you cover all the subjects, all the disciplines of arts and fine arts, even philosophy, you will see that a lot of learning is going on in those temples. And one, we keep talking about the left ecosystem and how they are very strong, or the Christian ecosystem or the Islamic ecosystem, and we often view that they are so immediate in reactions, and one thing happens in France and the reaction happens in Bhopal, and we view that the Hindu side does not have that kind of ecosystem. That is very true, but in order to create an intellectual ecosystem of that kind, you have to destroy a lot within the civil society. You have to destroy a lot of freedom inside a free culture like Hindu Dharma is. On the other hand, if we stick with institutions which are very living, very lively, like the Hindu temple, and proceed, congregate around these institutions which are still very, very living, and then proceed with our education, I guess both the problems will be solved. My apologies to Maharishi Dayanand, but I don't think there is any conflict between pursuing education and preserving that temple. That's all.
No,
Sorry
I
for
mean, I'll
that.
just make one comment before I move on to the questions that were asked by the participants. I mean, it's not that there is a direct conflict there, but it is actually a matter of focus, in the sense,
Priority.
if yeah, and you know, if one can't think in a vacuum. You know, suddenly intellectual development doesn't arise out of nowhere, right? You know, one has to be connected to the tradition, and the questioning has to be around the you know, what has been received, you know, the received wisdom. You either negate it, or no, you maybe extend it, you know, or maybe, you know, you deny it, or whatever. You know, it's against and within the context that already exists, you know, that one can progress, right? And that is precisely you know, what decolonizing would mean. You know, that you're actually able to engage with the tradition, right, in a meaningful fashion. You know, that you are able to actually extend it, or whatever, you know, move within that. You're able to ask the same or similar questions, or, you know, provide answers which were not given in the past. Now, you know, temple is obviously, you know, a different thing, you know, compared to engaging with the tradition. Engaging with the tradition, the primary way one would do is by dealing with the texts, right? The study of the text, you know, would be the most important thing to do. But you don't see that you know, anymore within the traditional you know, scholars. They are completely cut off from the modern education. So there is no questioning per se. It's just rote. Well, you know, I shouldn't make such huge generalizations, but I have to be careful. But not as much as one would believe. So there are two universes,
Yeah.
right? One very small traditional one, and one growing, massively growing, large one, which are going in parallel, and they're not talking to, you know, each other. In fact, I remember Varakedi Srinivas ji, you know, who is the vice chancellor of Kalida Sanskrit University now. In one of his lectures, he was saying, you know, we complain that people like Sheldon Pollock keep saying that Sanskrit is dead, Sanskrit is dead, and you say, no, it is not dead, right? So then he says, you know, when a person is lying on the table and he's been brought to the hospital, you poke him, you know, you you know, you put a knife on him, you hit him, he's not moving, he's not responding, he's not doing anything. Won't you call him dead? Right? So that's exactly, you know, what's going on here. Thank you very much. The question I have from Ram C is, what are your thoughts on Sri
Sri Aurobindo.
Aurobindo and his vision for future of India?
Yes. Well, let me criticize Aurobindo a little bit.
Okay.
You see, he was brought up in the West, and he had the whole education that Westerners have, but the most educated of Westerners have. He knew Latin and Greek. He won prizes in competitions in different languages, writing essays. Um, but so his main contribution to yoga, at any rate, is that he brought in the modern Western idea, now pretty universal, of evolution. And so I don't know if that's an enrichment. Evolution is something that happens in nature, nature, which is the opposite pole of the Purusha, of consciousness. And so whether in yoga evolution has much meaning, I'm not too sure. You see, maybe that doesn't take the very Indian distinction between nature and consciousness sufficiently seriously. But I mean, I'm not finished with this, but that's my hunch. Now, anyway, his vision for India. Well, you see, is I already quoted his Uttar speech, where he links Indian nationalism with Sanatana Dharma. That, of course, makes sense. Now, of course, Sanatana Dharma is bigger than India and is now taking its place both through expatriate communities and also through converts in the rest of the world. So, in that sense, his view is a bit antiquated, but of course, it's essentially the correct view. You see, if India is to be true to itself, it should rediscover, revive the Sanatana Dharma. That I'm all for. And so his vision of Hindu nationalism, I mean, in those days nationalism was all the rage, is a very sane one, a very healthy one. That of course I greatly support. Then his viewpoints on some specific political developments. Of course, there too, he clearly had his heart in the right place and his mind in the right place. Like when he called Mahatma Gandhi a little crack, that made sense. I mean, there were good things about Mahatma Gandhi, but the ones which were politically most consequential, unfortunately, were not so good. So he correctly saw this. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a question from Riddesh Seth. He says, do you think anti-conversion laws and uniform civil code will enable India to combat demographic warfare by Islamists and Christian missionaries? Or do Indic faiths have to become missionary?
Right. Well, on the first thing, my answer can be very clear. You see, I'm all for a common civil code. It's the essence of secularism. Like the Belgian constitution says, all Belgian citizens are equal before the law. And so that should be there in India. I mean, it's not a demand of Hinduism. Hindu societies in the old days did not have a common civil code. I mean, by caste, mainly by caste, there were different rights for different people. Like a Brahmin could be fined for being drunk on the street, whereas for a Shudra this was deemed normal. But a Shudra who committed murder would get the death penalty, and a Brahmin would not, and so on. So there was no common civil code there, and it worked. Now, in a modern society, I think we should have a common civil code. And so that should also extend to people who believe in Allah or in Jesus Christ. Um, but though I am for it, I do not expect the benefits that the questioner attributes to it. You see, Muslims are going to continue to have large families, even under a common civil code. In Europe, there are common civil codes, and yet, you see, the demographic difference between Muslims and the rest is also there. So that won't make a difference. Yeah, there are a few cases of Muslims practicing polygamy, maybe having 25 children instead of five. That's yeah, that's a factor. Okay, but it's quite marginal. At any rate, it will not do the trick. Um, Also, if Muslims become more prosperous, it doesn't follow, as it has done in the West and as it is doing among Hindus, that they're going to have fewer children. Take, for instance, Osama bin Laden. He had 5 wives and 30 children. See, among traditional Muslims, the idea is that if if you are fortunate enough that Allah has given you riches, you should use them to have a big family. So, I don't expect you can win the demographic war. And um, so for that, Hindus should become a missionary religion. That's not how I would put it. But yes, you have a great interest in bringing Indians of different faith back home. Ghar Vapasi or Shuddhi, as the Yasamaj called it. That is a good idea. I'm all for it. Though I noticed that in the beginning of Narendra Modi's government, the secularists made a big hue and cry about some case of Gharvapasi, and immediately the BJP politicians distanced themselves from it. They wanted nothing to do with Gharvapasi. As if the conversion policies of Muslims and Christians are any better, which they do accept. So I'm all for Gharvapasi, though you see, in its present state, it's something that works at a village level, and it has some successes to its credit. But among a modern, educated urban population, it sounds a bit quaint. There, I think the stuff that I'm working on is more useful, more consequential. Namely, you have to do a critical scanning of these religions and see and show why modern educated people should not stoop to this level. You see, Christianity may have certain merits, Mother Teresa or whatever, but at heart, it makes no sense. You see, it is not true that Jesus was the Son of God, at least in another sense than everybody is. It is not true that original sin is the cause of mortality. Animals who don't sin nevertheless also die. And it is certainly not true that Jesus rose from the dead, nor is it true that his rising from the dead cleared our sinfulness. These are the basic dogmas of Christianity, and they are obviously not true. Take my own case. You see, many people leave Christianity because they have some grudge against it, because they've been raped by the priest, or, you know, all the unpleasant social effects of Christianity. Now, I didn't have that at all. You see, Christianity has never done me any harm. I have very good memories of my time in the church choir and so on. But I just saw it's not true. And so nowadays, you see, you have many Muslims who, when they examine Islam critically, when, certain things are pointed out to them that they've missed during their religion class, um, that they too will start thinking twice and taking a more critical look at Islam and ultimately leaving it. But I admit that you see is at the moment something targeted at some very few people. At a mass level, I don't expect any big changes immediately, but I would count on the general evolution, both outside and inside India, towards better education, a more scientific temper, as they call it. Um, so that will make a difference. Whether fast enough, I can't predict. But ultimately, it is very sure that Islam and Christianity will disappear. Probably Islam in a more explosive manner than Christianity, just as it started in a more explosive manner. Um, but so what goes up must come down, whereas what is Sanatana is going to survive.
So actually, there's a related question. There's several questions around this, so I'm just rephrasing them. Usha BN, basically, and others as well. The question is that with the increasing self-assertion of Hindus, where do you see the country heading? Is there going to be a civil war kind of a situation? Will there be street battles that we will see in the near future?
Yeah.
How do you see, beyond the decade which Pankaj ji mentioned, maybe
Right.
in the next 100 years, where do you think, where do you see this going?
Well, as I just said, I am very optimistic for the long term. But before we get there, many things can still happen, including civil war. And so you see, Hindus would be foolish to provoke it. Like, for instance, um, a common civil code. You see, insisting on a common civil code right now, there are far more important issues. It is those that you should insist on. You see, equality in the constitution, that is important. Then, of course, after that is done, then Hindu civil society will have to prove its mettle. Because, the fact that you can have your own schools doesn't automatically mean that you make a useful instrument of those schools. That you will have to do yourself. But that's what you have in a free society. If you don't have a dictatorship, then you have to, you know, come out of your couch and do something. But nevertheless, those things are very consequential, whereas a common civil code is not. It's a correct principle, but it's not a priority. And so, if you insist on it, there you will get, I don't know, a civil war. At any rate, you will get massive protest from every mosque in India, because there, the Muslims see this Sharia as an intrinsic part of Islam. So they will say, "Oh, but you are hurting freedom of religion." Even though you see Muslims are living in France under secular secular laws, nevertheless, for India, they will say, "Oh, we are being persecuted by this ugly, overbearing Hindu majority." Um, and so they will feel emboldened to take to the streets, to take to arms. And so it's a very dangerous situation. Sometimes in life, dangerous situations are unavoidable. But here you see, it is totally unnecessary. You concentrate on the essentials.
There's a question from Ambika S. You had mentioned in your Twitter um, post that you are planning to write in detail about history of castes in India.
Yeah.
When do you think this will come out?
Well, I have to correct that a little bit. I mean, I don't have much to add about the detailed history of castes. Like just yesterday, I heard on Zoom a lecture about the Kakatiya dynasty in Andhra, how they were Shudras, proud of being Shudras, and also at the same time giving agraharas to Brahmins and so on. So not at all living up to the leftist stereotype that you see they were anti-Brahmin because they were Shudra and they facilitated the transition to Islamic rule. On the contrary, they fought the Muslims, and um, and the Muslims in return didn't give them a better treatment because they were Shudras. No, you see, once the Kakatiya king was captured, you see, he was taken as captive, he was tortured to death. So such details are like beyond me. It's too late in life to really get to know all of that. But that I leave very much to Indians. However, yes, the whole idea of caste and how it evolved, there I think I can contribute. And so, in a few words, what Hindus must know about it. Um, Dayananda Saraswati was correct in saying that the Vedas didn't know caste. At least the family books of the Rig Veda are totally without caste. Then it starts appearing, at least the idea of a division in society starts appearing in the Purusha Sukta. But it's not about caste. It doesn't say endogamy. It doesn't say hereditary profession. The typical constitutive things of caste. But so in the Mahabharata, you see it start, and then testimonies by the Buddha, for example, you see it evolve. First, it's a patrilineal system. You have the caste of your father. Your mother's caste is not important at all. Like Vyasa, Brahmin par excellence, was the son of a Brahmin father and a fisherwoman, the mother. And um, then the element of endogamy came in, probably first among the elites, like Prasenajit in the life of the Buddha, and then generalized. And this fits with the genetic findings that caste endogamy is not older than 2,000 years. Now, to say, oh, it is totally un-Hindu, it has nothing to do with Hinduism, that is not correct. You see, it does not have to do with the basic doctrines of Hinduism, that is correct. So to say, like Ambedkar did caste the soul of Hinduism, that's historically inaccurate. However, for about 2,000 years, caste was very much a part of Hindu sensitivities. They cared a great deal about caste. And so it's only now that it is eroding, and even now secular politicians are trying to keep it alive for electoral purposes. Um, so, there you should take a nuanced view of caste. So no, caste is not Hinduism. Hinduism can exist without caste. Like, for instance, the overseas communities in Suriname and in Holland have no caste. You know, I mean, after some generations of living there, they've forgot about it. And so this is perfectly possible, Hinduism without caste, if that's what you want. Um, but so, uh, I mean, Hindus are too quick to fall into the polemical positions uh, suggested by the enemy side. The enemy side is totally against it and identifies it totally with Hinduism, and therefore militant Hindus are totally denying that it is Hindu. Well,
The truth is probably somewhere in between. So there's some questions about the what's happening in France and how it links back to us. So, I mean, I'm rephrasing the questions here because there are multiple questions. The whole issue under discussion should actually be about Islamic prohibition for Muslims of any sort of a pictorial representation of their self-proclaimed prophet, right? Now, but because of the way in which the cartoons were done, right, which probably are disagreeable to many Hindus as well, right? The focus has shifted to the disagreeable nature of the cartoons rather than the very simple fact of representation of the
yeah,
self-proclaimed prophet, right? So probably what the French have done in terms of depicting disagreeably is in fact taking away from the whole debate of the Islamic imposition of their will, that, well, it is not just the Muslims who is not supposed to draw any or make representations of the self-proclaimed prophet, but even others should not. Which normally, if somebody is not doing it in a disagreeable fashion, they should not have any issue with it. But still, that is not the case. So this whole Charlie Hebdo thing actually takes the whole debate in a different direction altogether, which is not very amenable to pointing out the fact that what is Muslims are asking for is unreasonable, that others should also not make any sort of a representation. So that's one thing. Second thing is that ex-Muslims, like Armin Nawabi, right? So they do something similar, by drawing offending, cartoons and pictures about Hindu goddesses and
mhm,
gods. They're placing themselves in a position where Hindus who are actually feeling good about what Charlie Hebdo is doing suddenly are very upset when
yeah,
they see what Armin Nawabi does. So the clearly the issue here is a little entangled and confused, right?
mhm.
And Hindu positions are also a little confused here.
Yes, they are.
So what is your opinion
They
about
are.
this?
Yeah. Well, let me first return to the distinction between the state and civil society. You
Okay.
see, what the French state has to be concerned about is its legal system of freedom of speech. So, whatever is on the cartoons, the French state has to defend it. It has not to defend the fact that that particular drawing is made, has to defend the fact that it is allowed to make these drawings, whatever they are. Uh, as for civil society, well, okay, one existing current within it is that Charlie Hebdo current that is very extreme and nasty, not only extreme, or nasty against Muhammad, but also against all kinds of personalities and currents and phenomena within French society, including Catholic religion, and so on. But their civil society can react. You see, if you don't like this kind of cartoon, you may make your point by, for instance, boycotting the paper that published them, You can write to them. You can say everywhere, there's an alternative way. You can produce better, more tasteful cartoons that make the same point, but in a less crass manner. So that's what you can do in this case too. You can also protest. If you think these things are worth protesting, then you can protest civilly. Like, for instance, there was a French company that depicted Hindu gods on, I think, toilet paper. And so the Hindu human rights group in London organized a demonstration before the French embassy, um, impersonating all kinds of French things like the guillotine, the beheading machine and so on. But just, to create the atmosphere that, hey, France, think of your own traditions and stop doing this. You wouldn't want to have this done to yourself. And effectively, that stopped. You see, that company revoked its policy. So in India too, just this morning I saw the um, the poster that you clearly refer to with two naked Hindu goddesses in lesbian embrace. So so yeah, I mean that may not be nice. Well, there are civil ways to protest against it, and these can be very successful. Like take the Tanishq campaign.
Ah,
There was no government action, there was no RSS action and so on. There simply were a few people on social media creating opinion about it, drawing attention to the absurdity, and so the company withdrew this cartoon or this drawing. So there is no need to call for diminishing freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is essential. I mean, to have a democracy, it is essential that people can say and can read and see all the opinions available. I'm a freedom of speech fundamentalist, and so I don't see here any reason to change that.
okay. There's a question from Poonam Sharma.
So, sir, do you believe in
Go ahead.
universal? Just to add to your question, do you believe in universal value system and absolute freedom of speech, or do you think that there is the West box at our horizon and there is universal relativism? But do you think it is possible in context of Sanatan Dharma has always gone about multiple value systems, banked itself on
Mm.
multiple value systems? So in future,
Yeah, yeah. Um,
yes.
about that, I haven't thought deeply enough. But at any rate, I think on the issue of freedom of speech, this is not a problem. You see, again, I do think freedom of speech is fundamental. So, you see, if in India you want to do something insulting to the Hindu gods, I still think you can do it. Though you have to, of course, accept all the disapproval you will get. You don't need to be beaten up for that, but there are ways of
Okay,
making
thank you.
it very unpleasant to continue this.
Okay, I have a question from Poonam Sharma. She, so, yeah, she asks, Konrad Elst, will you be writing more about your encounters with Sitaram Goel and Ram Swarup? Your previous work about them has been a delight to read.
Mhm.
I think they're talking about your the communalist book, probably. Yeah, the edited volume.
Well, about Ram Swarup, I am writing down my memories at the moment. So we hope to have a Sitaram Goel Centenary Conference on the 16th of October next year, 2021.
21.
And so by that time, this book on Ram Swarup should be finished. Um, so that I'm working on. About Sitaram Goel, well, I don't think I have much to add to what I wrote in 2005, but yeah, it is imperative to do that now because now there are still people who knew them alive. And so let me take the opportunity to make a call to everyone who knew them or even who was just influenced by them to write down what you know. Because, just for the sake of history writing, it's very important that this is done now because soon it will be too late.
Yes. Ramakrishnan ji, you have a question. Please go ahead and ask. You're muted.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes,
Okay.
you are.
So this is a question I wanted to ask. In the Buddhist texts, there is a description, physical description of Gautama Buddha. So from this, is it possible that the Shakyas themselves were a Central Asian tribe?
Yes, there are a number of scholars who say so, like Michael Witzel, for example, who points out that Shakya looks suspiciously like an Indian bastardization of the word Shaka, meaning Scythian, which is a Central Asian Iranian tribe. And so we have, after the desiccation of the Saraswati and of the whole Harappan area, a lot of migration eastwards. And so some tribes mentioned in the Vedic period in Western India, northwestern India, you do see some of them reappear in greater Magadha in the Buddha's area centuries later. So this tribe might be one of them. And so his physical description as tall and white compared to the average Bihari may indeed indicate that. And I'll add another argument. The Shakya tribe was endogamous, was very endogamous. You see, in the Brahmin tradition, there are so-called forbidden degrees of consanguinity. You can't marry your sister, you can't marry your niece. Only then it starts. I think on the maternal side, you can marry your next cousin. On the paternal side, it's still 2 more degrees. But anyway, there is this obligatory distance in blood kinship. Now, this is not the case among the Shakyas. Like the Buddha himself had only 4 great grandparents. Normally, you have 8 of them, which means that the how is it again? The great grandfather on the paternal side married the sister of the great grandfather on the maternal side, something like this. So there was a lot of inbreeding within this family. So the Buddha himself was a very incestuous child. And all the Shakyas were. Now, you see, among the Iranians, that was the custom, cousin marriage, as it still is in Islam, as it also was among the Dravidians. You see, there it has declined under Brahminical influence, but it was also there. And so, in fact, if I were a Dravidian separatist, I would immediately use that as an argument. Hey, the Buddha was a Dravidian. That's why he was anti-Vedic. But so, you see, that could also be an indication for an Iranian provenance. Now, I don't think it makes any difference. But yeah, you see, historians research so many things that have no consequences. So yeah, it could be. I'm open to the possibility.
Okay. Thank you very much, Conrad. We have a lot more questions and some more questions have appeared. So what I will do is I will export all these questions from Zoom and I'll send the file to you. You could probably respond to them on Facebook, if not Twitter. But there's one comment from Meenakshi Jain ji, which I'd like to read, before we end the session for today. So Meenakshi Jain says this: Conrad's life has truly been dedicated to presenting a deep understanding of Indian civilization in its various facets. Conrad has contributed enormously to our understanding of Indian civilization. His range is amazing, and he is the first author one goes to for a decolonized view of our past. Looking forward to his new publications. So that's what he says. With that, I'd like to thank Conrad Elsji for spending this time with us and giving a peek, into your thought. And I thank all the speakers today, Ramakrishnan ji and Ashutosh ji, Pankaj ji, and also Harikiran ji, for taking time to be on this program and talking to Conrad ji. I thank all the attendees as well for sticking on. We are almost 40 minutes beyond schedule, but it was a fantastic event, and I'm really looking forward to the recordings from V. Srinivas and Koti Ramprasad ji. I mean, they've been the hosts and taken care of all the logistics aspects of this. I thank them as well. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Good day. Good day. Namaste.
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 And thank you, Srinivas ji and Harikiran ji.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.